Friends, it's Morgan Snyder, and welcome back to another podcast episode of Become Good Soil. Normally, we do the podcasts on audio, but because of Zoom and the times in which we are in, we had the privilege and honor to have a really special guest, Abigail Shrier, join via Zoom for a video and audio podcast. And so before we turn into this podcast with Abigail, I want to begin with a story. It's a story that was captured by Abigail and produced as a video by PragerU. And it is titled The Borderline Bar and Grill, A Tale of Men and Masculinity.
The mass shooting at the Borderline Bar and Grill in Southern California on November 7th, 2018, is a tale of men and masculinity. Lost in the carnage is a lesson we would all be advised to heed. That lesson has little to do with the monster who took lives and everything to do with the men who saved lives. The killer was 28 years old, lost, lonely, and living with mom. He had been a regular at the Borderline Bar and Grill. He knew that on Wednesdays, college country night, the place would be packed with kids, laughing and dancing. He entered tossing smoke grenades, then unloaded his handgun, fitted with an illegal extended magazine, into the crowd. But there were other young men there too. One of them was 20-year-old Matt Wennerstrom. In interviews, Wennerstrom looks like a typical college student. Backward baseball cap, gray t-shirt, jaw scruffy with a few days' growth. On camera, he seems laconic, humble, willing to answer questions, neither eager for the limelight nor afraid of it. As soon as he heard the shots, Wennerstrom told ABC News, he knew exactly what was going on. He and some friends grabbed everyone they could and pushed them down behind the pool table, placing their own bodies on top of the girls. One woman, who was celebrating her 21st birthday, told Good Morning America, "There were multiple men who got on their knees and pretty much blocked all of us with their back toward the shooter, ready to take a bullet for every single one of us." When the shooter paused to reload, Wennerstrom grabbed a bar stool and tossed it through a window. He and his buddies pulled 30 to 35 people to safety. After getting each group safely to the parking lot, Wennerstrom and his buddies went back for more. A reporter asked Wennerstrom how he knew immediately what was going on in the loud, crowded bar. "Instinct, I guess," he said. "I'm here to protect my friends, my family, my fellow humans, and I know where I'm going if I die, so I was not worried to sacrifice. All I wanted to do is get as many people out of there as possible." This is the masculinity we so often hear denigrated. It takes as its duty the physical protection of others, especially women. This masculinity doesn't wait for verbal consent or invitation to push a person out of harm's way. It sends hundreds of firefighters racing up the Twin Towers to save people they've never met. And it sent Sergeant Ron Helis of the Ventura County Sheriff's Office rushing into Borderline Bar and Grill, where the shooter was waiting for him. "I gotta go handle a call," Helis had just told his wife over the phone. "I love you." The 54-year-old husband and father died at the hospital from the wounds he suffered as he tried to stop the rampaging gunman. The way so many women have a natural ease with caring for children, so many men have the instinct to protect and serve. It is a refined sort of masculinity that must be developed and praised. The military has done this for years. Police academies and fire departments do it too. Only the educated classes have learned to sneer at it. Would that they never need it. There will always be young men like the Thousand Oaks shooter, full of rage, mentally unstable, failing to launch. We can work to eliminate the threat they pose, or treat whatever mental disease hobbles them, but we will never stop every evildoer from obtaining weapons. The extended magazine that enabled the shooter to fire so many rounds is already illegal in California. As many laws as we pass, we will never eradicate evil. So here's the lesson. Masculinity is a style of behavior, not a code of conduct. It can be used for great good, and it can be perverted into evil. One of the most important tasks of a moral society must be to make boys into good men. If we continue to disparage the male impulse to act heroically, if we mock those who want to protect women, we will fail in our task. Yet many seem bent on doing just that, especially in our institutions of higher education. Fortunately, Matt Wennerstrom and his friends missed the lecture that young women don't require male protection. Thank God they did. I'm Abigail Shrier for Prager University.
Friends, when I watched Abigail's video, I was moved to tears, and I was surprised by the tears. And I think what most moved me was to see a woman of substance, a woman of influence, a woman of just charisma defending masculinity. We have every reason to understand how femininity has been harmed by men. And I have dedicated the last 22 years of my life's work to see men being restored to become the kind of men that can bring strength and care and love to women, to children, to communities. But I was so moved to see a woman take a stand and say, we must not denigrate masculinity, but instead we must look for ways to promote the good, to help boys become men, to participate in the restoration of masculinity as it was meant to be. And so today, it is my honor to have Abigail with me, joining in this curious conversation and exploration about the path and the process of masculine restoration. Abigail, welcome.
Hi.
Thank you for taking this time.
Sure.
Well, I've been looking forward to this for about 8 months.
Oh, wow.
And this is a real treat. And I had no idea that the timing would line up with your book launch.
Oh, great.
And I'm very grateful that I get to champion you, Abigail. It's
thank
what
you.
this is all about, is championing what God has entrusted to your care. I've been really impacted. And so I'm just excited to dive in with you.
Oh, thank you. Go, sure, go right ahead.
I was given the video of the Borderline Bar and Grill and Tale of Men and Masculinity by several different men the week that it came out. And I had never met you. I'd never had the privilege of reading your writing in the Wall Street Journal, but a big fan of Prager University for a lot of my older mentors. And so I've had trickle down stories from there, but to be fully authentic, I started crying when I watched that video. And Abigail, I had to pause and ask, why am I tearing up? Why am I so emotional? And what I realized, my work, my vocation has been fighting for the hearts of men for 22 years, to see them restored, to see them walk in wholehearted masculine strength, and particularly to bring that strength to men and women, and to see a woman who was substantive, courageous, and defending masculinity, standing up to say, there's something good here. I don't want this missed. And masculinity often gets denigrated, and rightly so. There is much carnage on the field, but you took a stand to name something that was very beautiful. You know, in that story for our listeners, it's a story of a killer that goes into a bar. He's a lost and lonely 28-year-old. He's living with mom, as you said. It's his regular bar, the Borderline Bar. And he goes in on a busy night, and he's a shooter. He's armed with illegal weapons. He throws smoke grenades. And then there's another man in the story, Matt Wennerstrom, and he ends up using his body as a shield among other young men. And one of the women who you quoted said there were multiple men who got on their knees and pretty much blocked all of us with their backs towards the shooter. They were ready to take a bullet for every single one of us. And you went on to tell the story that he stood up. His words were, I'm here to protect friends, family, and fellow humans. It was the right thing to do. And that's true. There is another story of masculinity, of it being in the service to protect and provide and love, but so few people give voice to that, particularly women. So I was very moved, and that began my relationship with your work in the world. So I'm very honored to see your face. And just to start here, where do you go thinking of that story and this topic of masculinity? What would cause you to want to champion that message?
Well, first of all, it's true. It was a true story that happened. This was a young man who was a regular college student at a bar, that night in California, and a shooter walked in, and he rose to the occasion and acted like a true American hero. And when something like that happens, it's so remarkable, and it's worth sort of taking a moment to figure out
what made him do it, and look at how many lives were saved, and shouldn't we be celebrating his courage? So I wrote about it both because it was true and because I think it represents what we've lost. And the reason we've lost it is because there could be generations of Matt Wennerstroms. But I do believe today, certainly the radical left is trying to stamp them out. It's trying to make sure that young men never feel nobility, never feel that they might be called to protect others and act for good. And unfortunately, the left has done such a job of making women feel bad for being women and men feel bad for being men, and everybody in between, that unfortunately it's much harder today than it ever has been to act on our nobler instincts.
I'm curious, Abigail, there's got to be a backstory, right? Every person's life is a story. And I love in your book, which we will definitely get into in this time, you talk about your dad. And I'm really moved by him. And so as you share about masculinity and how we have made it terrible to be man, we have made it terrible to be woman by culture, particularly higher education, there's this thread of curiosity of where do you come from? Who is Abigail Shrier? And so I would love to pause on that idea and now back up and ask this question. You must have had a model. You must have had some picture of what masculinity is from your story. And I'd just love to hear in your words what that was.
So I wrote about this, actually. I wrote about my own father for the Wall Street Journal in a piece called Masculine Dads Raise Confident Daughters, I think it was called. But I wrote about my own dad. I've always been very, very close to my dad. And the reason that piece resonated with so many people, and it really did, it became sort of a phenomenon. They had me on Fox and Friends talking about it. And the reason it did was because I think I told a story of my own masculine father and what that did for me as a girl, as his daughter. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of men are not aware of how important men can be in the lives of their daughters. There is when a young woman sees that her husband, that her father treats her with respect, and he is, admiring of women and has high expectations for her, when she goes out into the world and dates men, she will expect the same because she had a model at home from the most important man in her life.
I love in your own words, and I'll grab a few here from another article where you shared, my father's own unapologetic masculinity made us feel secure. It made itself known in the shuffle of his loafers against our linoleum floor, the rumble of his voice, the two-fingered whistle whose sharpness both impressed and alarmed. And yes, he has held plenty of doors. The notion that this signified anything other than courtesy could never persuade me, since its origin for me was with him.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I think today, the idea that a man holding a door for a woman is somehow offensive, sexist, or unkind is really ridiculous. But if we keep assaulting all masculinity, the worry is that we won't produce men who are there for their daughters, men who are protecting their daughters, and men who are preparing them to expect a lot from the men in their lives.
Yes. Oh, I think I spend so much time, Abigail, with men who haven't been prepared, right? And women who haven't been prepared because of the lack of masculine love, particularly an appropriate physical touch of just the affection, a place where my daughter's name, Abigail. And so I love your name. And I remember when she was young, God gave me that name for her, and it's the delight of her father's heart. And I remember when I received that name, I just knew that's what I wanted to communicate and convey in all things. She was entering her tween years, and I was asking my wife, Sherry, what does she need? Help me understand what Abigail needs from me. And she said, at the center of her soul, she needs to know that you delight in her, and nothing she does or doesn't do, and nothing she says or doesn't say will cause you to withdraw your delight. And I'm just struck by how often I encounter men, and in my own story, it's similar to me, of in the brokenness, the uninitiated, the boy inside the man doesn't have the capacity to bring the love that that person needs, and then they end up ill-equipped for the battles that they face.
I think her advice is very good. I think that's right.
Hmm.
I think that, I don't want to jump ahead, but I interview obviously a lot of people in my book, and a lot of girls who are in very real distress. And very often the fathers are afraid to stand up for what they think is right and for the protection of their daughter, because they're afraid of contravening political correctness, even
Yes.
when they think their daughter's welfare is at stake.
Hmm. And what do you see, Abigail? What shifts it? What's the distinction between the men that do stand, or what shifts in the life of a man in your observations where he begins to become the kind of man that will take a stand?
Oh, that's interesting. Well, he has to have a certain amount of confidence. It's okay and in fact good for a man to protect his children.
Yes.
And by the way, a woman needs to protect her children as well. But we don't shame women as much for protecting their children as we do men. And men have been told to some extent that the welfare of their children is not really their business.
Mm.
And it's a mistake. I mean, I have seen really good fathers go along with their daughters, mental health unraveling, because they're afraid to say, wait a second, this isn't about politics. Like, she's in harm's way.
Yes. Oh man, it's very true when you get into these, especially in your book, which we'll turn a corner into in a moment. But it's life and death sometimes, right? Or at least the accusation is. So often, if you don't do something, right, this person's going to take their life. Your daughter will take her life. Or if you do a certain thing, they will take their life. Like, these are high stakes poker games. And so that word confidence, I think, is a really important word. Before we shift to the book, I want to just get a little more backstory. In our kind of highest level leadership events, one of the things that we do two things that are kind of guidelines. One is we ask every man to give us his cell phone. So when he comes to a retreat, he actually has to turn in that cell phone for 4 days so that he can be present. And it's the greatest gift. Guys go through detox and they have the shakes, and then finally they settle down, their soul shows up. The other thing we do is we require that they not say what they do for a living. Now, we know what they do. We've gone through extensive applications, but everyone there is a chimney sweep. So if you have to talk about your world, you're a chimney sweep. And you can talk about the other chimney sweeps, or this chimney sweep above you that, was holding off your raise. But everyone's equal, because what we found about the human soul is so often we hide behind what we do and we miss who we are. And so Abigail Shrier is a big deal. You're a big deal, and you have amazing career, and you have changed the world through your work, PragerU and Wall Street Journal. I just want to get curious about the woman behind the titles. And I would love for you to share with our audience, not what you do, but who you are, the story of Abigail Shrier, and a little bit for us to simply know the heart where your passion and your work comes from.
Well, okay. So I would say that, I was always very close to my dad growing up. I was always tomboyish. I always felt very different from my mom, and very different from other girls. I was sort of the sort who would say things that seemed to me true, that, as I got older, people would say, oh, you can't say that. And I was sort of the sort of person who would say, wait, which thing can I not say?
Yes.
So I think that I always had this real sense that the thing to be afraid of was was lies or deception, but not really the truth, which doesn't make me brave, because there's all kinds of things I'm afraid of. I mean, for sure. Let me just say, like, there's not a time when my kids leave the house that I'm not, terrified something will happen to them. But I'm not afraid of the truth. I'd rather just know it, because if you know it, you can confront it or deal with it or change or protect yourself. But the idea that we should just go around taking care of everybody's feelings, making sure everybody feels, happy with you all the time is a fantasy world,
Mm-hmm.
right? In which people are not doing well and problems are occurring all around us, but no one's fixing them. So
Yes.
that's not the kind of world I want to be in.
That makes so much sense. I have Dallas Willard is one of my heroes, a mentor, and he was a USC philosopher and a brilliant theologian. And he had this statement. He said, "Reality is what we bump into when we're wrong." And I just thought it's so helpful. I was moving furniture years ago, and I walked into a glass wall at this really high-rise bank, and I had bruised my whole face because I never saw that wall, though it was there. It was a fact. It was an objective reality that I learned the hard way. And so I love to hear you say that though you may fear things, you are not afraid of the truth, and you want to excavate it and bring it forth.
Right. And I think your wife's advice was very good, reflecting on really, really excellent advice, like reflecting on my own experience. So, I went through, I was a tomboy. I went through a, challenging adolescence as every young girl does, in the sense that, I was dumped, or I had boys who I liked who didn't like me back, and every sort of imaginable thing that girls go through. And I did things sometimes that were unpopular, or I took unpopular positions or whatever. And through it all, my father's pride was right there.
Yes.
That was the one thing I never doubted. So, boys in my class could make fun of it, or make fun of me, or, snicker at this and that. But they were just boys. They were just silly boys in my class. I mean, next to my father's respect and love, they just didn't mean very much.
It's almost like you're describing a reservoir. It's like a reservoir of a buoyancy, of knowing that you have a worthiness of love and belonging, right? Knowing whatever they do or don't do, or don't say, however they treat you, they don't have the verdict on you, right? They don't have say over who you are.
That's exactly right. Even if, and that doesn't mean that they couldn't hurt my feelings. Of course they did. But then I would come home and I would see my father, and I would realize these boys were peons. They didn't matter. And they couldn't compete. So whatever they had to say stayed at school.
That's amazing. So on the topic of good men, I also want to talk about Zach, who I believe is your husband.
Yes.
Is that correct? Okay.
Yeah.
I inferred that from the dedication of your book, but I loved, and I want to quote your words here, Abigail, is his love was your secret weapon. And you said, my husband, and this really stopped me in my tracks and is going to be the conversation of my next date night with my bride, Sherry, over very strong drinks, because that's what I'm going to need. Your comment, my husband performs the daily miracle of never wanting me to change. Just this idea of, I love you as you are. I bless you in who you are. He's read every word and improved every idea in this book, and much more than that. He made it possible to bear so many years and so much hate with the promise that I need not face them alone. Tell me, in ways, again, I'm not asking for disclosure. I respect your boundaries, but a lot of men who want to become wholehearted and strong on behalf of women are listening to you. A lot of women are listening to you that are championing their man or wanting to do so. I would love to know a piece of that, where that piece of your story shaped you in the woman that you are as an ambassador for this message.
Well, like a lot of writers, I'm an introvert. So I do best sort of, alone in a room with a computer or paper. I don't, going out into public and doing media appearances is certainly not the easiest part of the things that I've had to do. And if I didn't have my husband's support, it would have been, I don't know that I could have done it, really, because, you know, like a lot of couples, and, you know, this applies, I think, whether you're heterosexual couples or same-sex couples, you know, you tend to sort of reach a balance or balance each other out. And in our case, you know, I'm very much the introvert of the two of us. And he's much more socially bold. And I think that makes it easier for me to face social situations that require, you know, a certain bit of acting on my part.
Yes. Was there a moment for you two where you said, are we going to do this? Like, we're going to launch this book. Like, we're going to step in and go to war.
So he really has nothing to do with the book. This was my decision. This was something I investigated. This was something I looked into. So he certainly didn't make any decisions about the book or whether I was going forward with this. I found something that seemed to be a problem, and there seemed to be no one or almost no one willing to tell the truth about it. And I was a young girl. I mean, here's where, you know, my book is a really personal sort of reflection on being a woman and girls today to some extent, because I felt like I knew these girls. I had a real sense of them. I know what it's like to be an adolescent girl. So when I started looking into this, and I, you know, looked at the research and I talked to all kinds of experts, I really felt like I had a handle on what their experience was and what was wrong. And I care very much about the future of our young women.
I can see that in the writing. Like, there's just so much dignity. Abigail, if I had to use one word to name the what you have written in this book and all the haters and the naysayers, I want to say it's a book bestowing dignity. And I tried to wordsmith what is my kind of one-line elevator piece to describe irreversible damage, which is the title of your book, right? The transgender craze seducing our daughters. And that's a big title. I mean, it's bold. But here would be my one-liner, is I would describe my experience reading, savoring every word, is it's a rescue mission and a daring inquiry, fighting for the dignity of a vulnerable, underserved, and at-risk population, the teenage girl. That was my experience of it. I'm curious, like, what you think when you hear those words.
I love it. That's exactly what it is.
That's awesome.
It's a rescue mission. It's a rescue mission. That's exactly what it is.
I want to bring our listeners in, because a lot of listeners, this actually may be a new topic. I really pursued the opportunity to connect with you on gender and on masculinity, but actually this is all one in the same. And so I want to bring them into it with a bit of context, and then I'd love for you to unpack it for us. Sure. I'm pulling this from the article that you wrote, Wall Street Journal, on Amazon, and how they have willingly shut down all paid promotion on your book, which I'm praying and hoping will backfire and actually just send more people through controversy to find the life-giving message that you have. But in it, you're describing gender dysphoria, which is essentially a severe discomfort in one's biological sex. And I'd love to hear basically, you know, what you shared was the big idea is that there's transgender identification among teenage girls. It's become a sort of social contagion. In other words, as you said, a shared experience that's so universal to adolescent girls is struggling with deep underlying issues that manifest in external ways in things historically like bulimia, anorexia, or cutting. Today, these many women in alarming, exponentially growing statistical numbers are having gender dysphoria, and they're choosing irreversible surgeries and irreversible hormone treatments to try to deal with this discomfort. The statistics in your book are alarming. I would love for you to just give a little context, someone that's brand new to the idea of gender dysphoria, and someone that says, oh yeah, there's always been issues of people of gender dysphoria. What's new and what's alarming?
So we have nearly 100-year diagnostic history of gender dysphoria, the severe discomfort in one's biological sex. We know exactly what it is. We've studied it now for 100 years, and it's overwhelmingly afflicts males, okay, little boys and men, and
Yes.
it begins in early childhood, ages 2 to 4. And there's a lot of extant scientific literature on this. What we've never seen before in all this history is what we're seeing now, which is all of a sudden the predominant population, overwhelming majority of those claiming to be gender dysphoric are teenage girls with no childhood history of gender dysphoria, often who come out with their friends after social media immersion on transgender sites on the internet. This doesn't look like real typical gender dysphoria at all. It's a different thing. What it looks like much more, because these girls have high rates of anxiety, depression, and other mental health issues, it actually much more closely resembles things like anorexia, multiple personality disorder, ailments that girls convince themselves they have, often with their friends, because they're in pain.
Yeah, I think what's so important and what I hear you saying is we're talking about two very different things, right? In your book, you quote the statistic like 0.01% of culture would struggle with this. It's mostly boys. It's 2 to 4 years old. And now you gave this one statistic, 2018 in the UK, 4,400% increase in gender surgeries. In 70% of those women. Like it's an epidemic of sorts. But what I hear you saying is there are two layers to it, that the statistics, the data suggests that below I guess we'll call it a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, there's almost always underlying issues of anxiety, depression, and in your book, what I so appreciate, you name that often the underlying issues are actually pretty normative to adolescent girls. In other words, they're normal stages of maturation that statistically 70% of young women move through even a thought of gender dysphoria to being a healthy, growing to be healthy without any ongoing issues. What are your thoughts on that?
So a few things. These girls are in real pain, and they're in more pain than we've seen before. And this isn't my research. That part is not my research. Other well-known academic psychologists, Jonathan Haidt, Jean Twenge, have looked into this. We know that teenage girls and even tween girls today are in mental health crisis. We know they're experiencing acute depression, suicidal ideation, even committing suicide, anxiety in numbers we've never seen before, massive increases. And we've been able to tie this to social media. The constant competition and comparison and feeling left out and feeling less than that social media encourages in this population is very detrimental to their mental health. And unfortunately, not only in the schools, but in social media, the answer is aggressively supplied that if they don't feel perfectly feminine, or if they don't feel perfectly pretty or comfortable in their bodies, that part being a totally normal experience, that they probably are boys trapped in girls' bodies. They're probably gender non-conforming or non-binary. There's something else besides just a girl.
You made the comment in your book that the social media supplies a microscope and performs the math. I was just stopped by that sentence where, like you said, that if they don't feel perfectly feminine, right? And it's a microscope. With the social media, you are bombarded with the message. You are less than, right? You cannot measure up, and the math doesn't add up. And the other piece, is fascinating. There was some research that I came across where it said, it was also arguing this idea that perhaps we are at the front end of one of the largest mental health crises in human history. And it was triggered by two episodes, one in 2007 and one in 2009. And in 2007, it was the introduction of the iPhone, the first generation. 2009, it was the introduction of the function of like and follow me. It was just fascinating that this cultural shift, if we could just back up to 30,000 feet and say, if it's true that our young women are being bombarded and it is a mental health crisis, it's actually not a gender crisis. But if you have troves of young women, these tweens and teens that don't feel good, they don't feel good in their body, they don't feel safe or feel loved or feel true in their femininity, they're reaching for help. And in the internet is offering other things that are equally damaging and for that help. And you talk about the celebrating of transition. You in your book, you describe like bulimia wasn't celebrated. It was empathized, but not celebrated, right? Cutting was not celebrated. It was empathized. But there is a culture of celebrating this really self-destructive behavior and micro communities that present it as normative. Can you share some on that?
Sure, absolutely. So that's right. This epidemic really doesn't have anything to do with being trans or gender dysphoric at all. In fact, it's just, as you say, one aspect of the mental health crisis that we're in. Because of that, you know, the problem is a young girl, and I interviewed a lot of them for my book, and their parents, when a young, 11-year-old, 12-year-old decides she's trans, especially if she decides to give herself a new name at school, the moment that occurs, rather than have adults behave as adults and say, wait a second, this girl's obviously in pain or she needs something, we should involve the parents. The schools will shut out the parents. They will absolutely keep her name a secret. This is policy in California. This is policy in New York. I've heard from parents in New Jersey the same. And they will shut out the parents. They will not tell them. And they will start fast tracking her with therapists and even with doctors towards transition. That's not the way we treat anorexics, which is why, we were able to contain it. It's why you haven't seen the explosion that we've seen in trans ID among this population of girls.
And a little bit later, hopefully, I would love to get to some of your antidotes and kind of some of your closing counsel in the book, which is brilliant and just dripping with wisdom. And you talk about some of that there. So I want to, before we go in that direction, I want to ask another question related to this. So my passion is masculinity restored. I want to see men become wholehearted and become the kind of men that can actually bring strength and dignity to women, to provide and protect and all the things that we love and stand in agreement for children, for schools, for communities, for nations. That's my passion. And I'm curious where you see the relationship between a failure in masculinity and this kind of craze we're seeing in culture. Like, is there a correlation, and is there a way that we can address the restoration of women? This isn't going away. So is there a correlation, and is there a way to address it in regards to thinking of men and their presence in the lives of these girls?
I haven't seen evidence of a correlation, but I will say this, I would not discount that. And I'll tell you why, because I interview fathers, and the moment their daughter comes up with this at 11 or 12, decides she's trans, the father feels like, oh gosh, I'm out of my element here. I have nothing to say. This is an LGBT.
Feels intimidated.
Right? Intimidated. This is an LGBTQ issue. This is some weird issue with her body. Maybe her mother knows better. I'm going to stay out of this. Whereas if it weren't such a politicized issue, if men felt more comfortable, I think, asserting themselves as the father, I think they'd feel more comfortable saying, look, honey, you're 11. Okay. You're not a boy. You've never expressed this before. What's really going on here? And instead, unfortunately, a lot of men are intimidated into a position where they sort of stay out. They stay out of it. They think whatever she's going through, this must be some weird girl thing or something. And I'll give you another example where I see that a lot. So I've written a bunch about women in sports, young women in sports, who are being, really unfairly beaten by biological men who identify as transgender, but biological boys on their sports teams, many of whom are very mediocre athletes as boys, but come in and to take the trophies and whatnot. And the number of fathers, of proud fathers who are upset about this is a lot. In America, if you see a girl athlete, you're going to see a great girl athlete. You're going to see some very proud parents behind her, supporting her very, very often. Mm-hmm. And a lot of fathers will reach out to me and they'll say, this is completely wrong. I can't believe they have boys in there competing with her, but they can't speak up. They feel like they can't speak up on behalf of their daughters because it's such a charged political issue. So I think that we, in society at large, we've effectively sort of neutralized men in a way, unfortunately, because they could be so valuable and they're not allowed to be.
It's interesting in what you're sharing. You said that story, a girl's 11, and if dad just said, honey, you're not a boy, you've never been a boy, what's going on? And I can feel as a man, as a father to a 13-year-old, I tighten up a little, because what you're suggesting is I have to go in with curiosity and care to really, I don't know a better way to say it, Abigail, than really become a student of my daughter's world, to actually be curious, to know her for what she's really feeling. And as a man, I can say it can bring up fear in what that has to say about me as a dad.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought of that, but that's true. I mean, I'll tell you what I see. I'm 42, and I'll tell you, so I'm a member of Gen X, and I'll tell you what I'll see about my generation in general. We definitely want to be more friends with our kids than parents. And one of the unfortunate side effects of that is that parents, when they hear their daughter say, oh, I'm pansexual, except she's 11 and she's never kissed anybody, they take her very, very seriously, as if she really is pansexual or whatever.
Wow.
And of course, any child's proclamation about sexuality or gender identity at 11 should probably be met with a lot of, skepticism and
yes,
some sense that this isn't a fully sexual being. It's a child still. And unfortunately, parents feel like they can't sort of remember that this is just a kid.
Yes. It's so important. And I'm a Gen Xer as well. I'm 44. And I get that. It's like, there's almost this holy grail. We might even name it connection, but we want to be friends, but we forsake being parents. Right. Yeah. And I think our parents were less involved emotionally, as in general, right? We're coming out of this detached, dad went to work and was disengaged. And so we want that friendship. So I love what you're saying. I think it's vital. There's something, go ahead.
Well, a woman called me maybe 2 weeks ago. I get calls from parents all the time, and she was going through this with her daughter. Her daughter suddenly trans-identified. Her daughter's mental health is getting worse. She's wearing a binder around the house. Binder is a breast compression garment that gives a girl, she wears it under her clothes, and it gives her the appearance of having a male physique, and it compresses her breasts. It can do all kinds of damage. And I said to the mom, she knows her daughter's not doing well. She does not believe the girl is genuinely, transgender. She thinks she came up with this with her friends who are also saying they're trans. And I said to her, why don't you take away her binder? She's still living in your house. She's, 14, 15, I get a lot of these calls, and she'll say to me, oh, I can't do that. She'll be so mad at me. And so I'll say to her, well, would you let her smoke cigarettes in your house? And she's kind of shocked, like, well, of course not. And you say, well, binders, absolutely damage breast tissue. They can cause shortness of breath, rib cracking, all kinds of problems. And you say that her mental health is deteriorating as she's convincing herself she's really a boy. Why do you allow this?
Abigail, okay, so you're talking about binders, and to take it another step deeper that you do in your book, there's this theme of parents. You shared in that story of, I don't want her to be mad, right? She's going to be mad at me if I take it away. But in your book, you come again and again to this accusation against parents. If you don't support their adolescent decision, they're going to kill themselves. And it's a constant theme. And like you say, in your research, it's very consistent, the patterns. You could almost predict what's going to happen when you probably get these contacts from parents early in the process. Like, what do you do with this dilemma of, I love my child, and they told me this child will kill themselves if I stand in their way?
Well, any threat of suicide, of course, has to be taken extremely seriously by an adolescent. I don't for a moment think you should discount that or not react in a safe and appropriate way to make sure that she's okay. But I wrote about in my book the fact that this threat of suicide is trotted out so aggressively and so inaccurately by therapists in order to coerce parents to do something that they don't think is right for their kid. And I want to say that these parents I have so much sympathy for these parents. They're in a bind. They're in a terrible bind. But one of the things they need to know about is the truth. And the truth is that we don't have any proof that gender dysphoria causes suicidal ideation, because there are absolutely similar levels of suicidal ideation in girls with other similar mental health problems, like the same levels of anxiety and depression that these girls have. But we also have absolutely no proof that affirmation, agreement with their new identity, and hormonal intervention, we have no proof that fixes suicidal ideation.
Yes.
So I would say it's really important to have more knowledge and not be led around by experts, some of whom aren't really experts at all.
Boy, that's really empowering, right? It's empowering. It almost like disarms the threat to say, back to your idea of don't fear the truth, like choose love, risk love. And yes, it's always a risk. We can't guarantee anything. I remember when my wife was struggling with a severe anxiety and depression, and I got to a point where I felt so powerless, and I thought, I actually can't save her life. I actually can't necessarily save our marriage, but I know what I can do in my power. I can become the kind of person that can choose to love her well. And I have a lot of growing to do, and this is exposing it. So I just really appreciate kind of your message to say it's worth risking love.
Yeah, I think it is. You want to do what's, especially with a kid, because with a kid, you're there to set boundaries. You're there to protect them. You're there to know better. That's actually your job. You're the only one who can. And what I found in my investigation is how many of the teachers have agendas. Therapists come in with an agenda. Even in the medical profession, you find all kinds of guidelines that are agenda driven. And the only person, all the teens online who want to encourage them, the only person in their lives who is 100% looking out for them is you, the parent. That's it.
And it almost sounds like it's the one person that's putting down their agenda, right? They're just almost out of a fear or a paralysis. They're reacting to the situation rather than the agenda of, I'm fighting for the dignity of this person, believing that my daughter is 11. My daughter was not 15 and she's not 25. And that's a big difference. Abigail, I think another piece that you point out in your book, this phrase, nobody knows who you really are except for you. There is this culture of self-actualization that if I say, I feel like a woman, and so I am a woman, like no one can question that. And it's almost like a glorification of the self. And I know that we both kind of draw on similar prophets of Jeremiah, right? Of some of the ancient historic literature where this prophet was speaking of kind of the heart of God, where he says that God would say, since before you were created, since before you were in your mother's womb, you were known. You were loved, and God had a sacred plan for you. And I think I'm just using that idea to be curious of how we address this idea of self-actualization, of self-defining, that are we truly autonomous beings, that the holy grail of an 11-year-old girl is what she thinks about who she is, contrasted to something beyond us, whether that's someone else shaping it or God in some larger story of our faith journey saying, no, you were created by something bigger than you. And finding that destiny is actually an essential part of your healing and maturity.
So the problem is these girls are finding these identities on the internet. They're finding them as a result of incredible pressure from social media stars who they worship. And they spend more time on social media with these social media influencers who are pushing, gender ideology and pushing testosterone. They spend more time with them than they do with actual girlfriends in person. And when they are in person, they're on the phone. So this isn't an authentic self-discovery. The way we discover
Yes.
ourselves is out in the world. But the way these girls are discovering their so-called identities, it's right in front of a computer alone.
It's fascinating. I haven't really thought about this until this moment, but in the book, you point out all the research that an 18-year-old girl today is not the 18-year-old girl of 20 years ago. She's actually more like a 15-year-old.
Yeah.
That the socialization is so much less. There's less engagement, more isolation, living online. And like you even said, like sexual experimentation, a lot of these girls that are going through these transitions haven't even been sexual and had sexual experiences because they simply haven't been socialized. But when they are with community, when they are with friends, they're also on their phones. And so it actually is still not the normal conflict and resolution of healthy relationship. And that's another result of smartphones.
Right. So they're very sheltered girls today, and they're not sheltered from a lot of pernicious influences. So they've all seen online porn, and much of it extremely vicious, women choking, being choked by men. I mean, stuff that really terrifies them. And so they have that image in their head. But what they don't have is the kind of growing up experiences of interacting with each other. So they aren't matured by going out with someone they're interested in romantically, getting dumped, working through that, sharing their secrets with their best friend. They do much, much less of that. And
Yes.
They do much more of confiding in the internet.
So I want, in light of that, I want to turn a little bit of a corner towards a motherly counsel. I want to name it that from your book. Like, yes, it's research. Yes, it's inquiry. Yes, it's a rescue mission. And in a rescue mission, I see a mother's heart, not only a brilliant journalist, but you're speaking to the heart, like your heart is invested in this mission. And in the close, almost to the close of the book, you offer these 7 succinct kind of pieces of closing counsel. And they feel like almost these proverbs. If we were just to orient our hearts as parents, as leaders, as men and women, to say, this is how we can care for young women. You offer these 7 ideas. I would just love, briefly, to hear a reflection on each one, if I could just read them to you. And can you give a sentence or two on what you mean by these?
Sure.
Therefore, we're fighting for this population of young women. And here's your counsel. Number 1, don't get your kids a smartphone.
Yeah, it's, obviously it depends what age we're talking about, because some of them already have smartphones and they've had them for years. So if you're talking about a 19-year-old or a 18 or 16-year-old, that's a lot harder. But if you're talking about a 11-year-old, that's much easier. There's no reason to start.
Number 2, don't relinquish your authority as parents.
That's right. You don't have to take, I said this before, but you don't have to take everything they say as true. You can empathize with them, sympathize with them, and help them without agreeing with everything they come up with about themselves.
Yeah, being a parent before being a friend. I think it's so beautiful. Number 3, don't support gender ideology in your child's education.
That's right. I think parents don't know how aggressive the gender ideology is in many of the schools. It's the curricula are written by activist groups. There are even activist groups teaching, training the teachers in this, and they are and they are even coaching after school clubs. And what they're doing is, starting in kindergarten, we have this in California, they plant the idea in children's heads that if they don't feel perfectly feminine or masculine for boys, that they might be something in between. And their gender could be anything. And this doesn't, of course, turn the kids into transgender identifying kids, but what it does is it gives them the idea. It plants sort of the seed, and then when these girls hit puberty and they are in pain and in distress, the solution sort of readily tees up.
The fourth counsel you have is to reintroduce privacy into your home.
Right. So a lot of parents and are allowing their teens to make all kinds of announcements on the internet, including I'm trans, I'm gay, I'm bi, whatever it is. And I say to them, would you let her put I'm boy crazy on the internet, knowing what people would get in touch with her, what grown men? And they would say no, because of course I don't want men from all over the internet knowing that my 15-year-old announces she's boy crazy. And then I would say, well, why do you allow her to do that for an LGBTQ identity then? I interviewed a lot of trans girls who, transitioned at some point, and one young woman who identified as trans and then stopped said to me, the moment that I posted that I was trans on the internet at 13, all kinds of adults reached out to me to congratulate me, to tell me I was brave, and then they began to take advantage.
Wow. So it's just so important to hear of. It's instantaneous celebration, right? It's instantaneous belonging. And so there's a sense of you're getting what you're looking for, and it's the place to be loved and belong. And then there's manipulation. It's so good to be oriented to this. Number 5, you suggest consider big steps to separate your daughter from harm.
Right. So if your daughter's already fairly indoctrinated and convinced she's a boy, and she seems to be pushing for hormones and going in this on a path that looks like it's not helping her, I have talked to parents who have completely removed their daughters from that environment, from their school environment. They've moved. The problem with social identity announcements online is that it tends to lock these girls in, and they'll decide they are pansexual at 12 or 13 or trans, and then they're too embarrassed to walk it back.
Yes.
So sometimes parents have had to take dramatic steps to get them out of that social setting so they aren't humiliated, because one of the aspects of this identity, unfortunately, is that those who celebrate you tend to punish you if you change your mind.
And in that, the data that you've shared in your book that's really interesting is so often the parents don't take the drastic steps. And so they just end up being behind and constantly behind until there are irreversible consequences, right? Where you have these girls now that they want to go back and they can't, or they have cut off all ties with their parents. And I'm struck by how many men in leadership, Abigail, that I've walked with, that like the story is once their kids are raised, we were always behind it because there was some culture of like underestimating and just trying to minimize instead of do something pretty drastic.
That's right. I mean, these girls, a lot of them go on to cut off their parents entirely and engage in dramatic self-harm that permanently alters their future in ways they are likely and do regret. So I would just say, parents will call me and they see their kids going down this road, but they'll say, oh, but she got into Yale. I can't not let her go. And I would just say, not taking this seriously as something that can go in a very bad direction very, very fast. It's so easy for these girls to start themselves on a course of testosterone. Most college plans cover it. And even the surgeries are easily paid for by these girls. So I would just say taking it very, very seriously and doing what you can to get her out of that indoctrination is a very good thing.
Yeah, and I really appreciate it. So much of your book was an education for me. I've known about the categories in general, but not in specificity. And like when you talked about these hormone treatments, you go on testosterone as a woman for several years. If you come off of it, not only is there significant risk of damage and many things we don't even yet know, but you can't go back. Like, it's not like you can simply reverse. You can end up being a woman with facial hair, with masculine features, with masculine body, that even off the hormones, you can't reverse that. You can't reverse the biology of losing, like you talked about with a double mastectomy. You may get implants, but you actually lose the faculties of this magnificent design system that's meant to generate life for a child. And so we're talking about irreversible decisions. So the stakes are pretty high.
That's right. The body is altered by testosterone and other things in dramatic and unfixable ways in certain ways. I mean, the voice never goes back. Very often they'll have a masculinized voice. Their features are changed by testosterone. They'll have facial hair, body hair, which doesn't mean that they can't go on with life if they choose to detransition. I mean, there are so many remarkable and wonderful detransitioners out there who decided they had regret and have moved on and are making wonderful lives for themselves. But let's just say that it takes a lot. It's
Yes.
not easy, and the harm done can be considerable.
Yes. I want to get to the last two and some other golden pieces of your story before we close. So the last two, number 6, is to stop pathologizing girlhood, and it fits with number 7. Don't be afraid to admit it's wonderful to be a girl.
Yeah, I think the other half of what you were saying about men being sort of shamed for being masculine is that women aren't told how great it is. Young women aren't told how great it is to be a woman. Somehow we've allowed the society to convince them that women is a victim class, that she's someone who is just a victim of abuse, and that the abuse is inevitable. And also that any boy who decides he wants, or any man, no matter who he is, who wants to march right into her locker room and shower, is free to do so. These things are all frightening young women about womanhood. And I think we need to sort of take womanhood back and not be afraid to say, you know, there are spaces that are just for women, for biological women, because we need to keep them safe. And there are, and the being a woman is a wonderful experience.
Yeah, as you're sharing that, I just feel in my heart of rising up to keep celebrating my daughter and the women for being women, to just be that aggressive voice of advocacy and championing. I know you said in a piece that you wrote, you said in the Me Too movement, one of the challenges that's rarely discussed is how to raise our daughters so that they possess a hard nugget of faith in their worth, something they are unwilling to dislodge, whatever the price. There's just an empowerment when a young woman is championed and to know her worth, and she's not willing to have that dislodged, whatever price. And frankly, Abigail, I see that in your life.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. I want to close with a piece on back to the impact of your work and the closing of your book. But before we go there, what would be on your heart while you have this audience, and you've obviously been entrusted to champion a mission? What haven't we covered that you would want to say, that you would want to put voice to or words to, that would help us to love young women and fight for masculinity and femininity restored?
I think that, you know, these things should be done without, you know, we can remember that we're allowed to stand up for our women, for our daughters, and for our young men without insulting anybody else, that it's not an insult to stand up for our girls. So the number of transgender adults who have reached out to me privately or allowed me to interview them and said to me, what these activists are doing is madness, is a lot. I hear from them all the time. And it's important to recognize that we can be kind to other people and treat them with civility and dignity, without allowing our young men or young women to come to harm. And those things, can and should be done together.
Yes. Yeah. As I shared, like there is so much dignity in your work. And I just want to sit with the naysayers and say, just read it. Read it. Take your time to see the sincerity of heart at which Abigail is bringing to championing these young people. So I just so appreciate your work. Abigail, like I said, my experience with you so far is bookended with unexpected tears to see a woman championing men when much of what we have brought of masculinity is not deserving of being championed. But I want you to know that there are men that are being restored and are becoming the kind of men that can be entrusted with the care of women, and bring dignity. And I'm among a group of courageous men that want to become more than we are. And so don't lose heart. And the bookend of the tears as I was finishing your book in preparation for this, which I just so was deeply impacted by, you close with this idea that a parent is always a parent, that they don't ever stop worrying, and they will always still hope for a phone call. And you said, as far as I can tell, that card never expires. You have nothing to lose. And so how about giving them a call? That's beautiful. What do you hear in that?
Oh, thank you. I just, some of these young women who have suddenly cut off their parents, we're seeing so much alienation today, family alienation. And unfortunately, a lot of it's being encouraged by very bad mental health professionals, not the good ones, the bad ones. And they're encouraging, we've got this idea out there that if your parents are toxic, you cut them off, right? If you don't agree with them, you don't like how they vote, you don't like how they think, you don't like, anything they have to say, they are toxic and you cut them off. It's a very ugly idea. It's very cruel to the parents, but in some ways, most importantly, it leaves their children at the mercy of people who just don't have their best interest in heart. There's only one group out of people I'm aware of that will lay down in traffic for their kids, for these young people, and it's the parents.
I know that this comes from a body of invested soul time with over 200 interviews, several dozen families. Like, you've been in the muck and the mire and the dignity. And I just want to close by saying, like, you are championing something that's true, something that's good, something that's beautiful, and something worth fighting for. And so we are cheering you on. And for our listeners that are intrigued, alarmed, curious, and they're saying, some of this is new to me, but I want to dive into Abigail's work. Like, where would you send them to become students of you as a teacher?
Oh, you're so kind. Well, I would say, certainly look at the book. I think the book's, people like it a lot. And, you can follow me on Twitter at Abigail Shrier.
Awesome. I'm going to take my line that I read to you, and that will be my book review, with probably some more on there on Amazon to champion you, Abigail. I think that a lot of people are going to benefit from the dignity of your life, and I just appreciate you being willing to respond, to engage.
Of course, anytime. I'm very honored to be on your show.
Could I pray for you? Would it be a blessing to you if I just prayed for you right now?
Thank you. Sure.
Yeah. God, I am so grateful for this woman, for Abigail and for Zach and for their kids. And I just pause to stand with her on behalf of what you've entrusted to her care. God, I pray that you would protect their boundaries and borders from hate and from accusation and disdain, from judgment and lies and envy. God, I ask that you would shelter their children, their home, their finances, this great work of this first book and this message, God, protecting these young women. I believe that you have set this opportunity as a flag on the field to say, we need your attention. We need your attention to protect these young women from harm. And so I pray that you would pour out resources of heaven into their home. God, as the psalmist says, that you lead us by still water, that you refresh our soul, that you will give us a feast in the presence of our enemies, and that we will find satisfaction. I pray that you will continue to pour blessings into the Shrier home, that you would strengthen them, that you would bring her advocates, that you would bring her champions, that you would bring her resources and protection, that she would feel buoyed, that she would feel lavishly cared for, that God, you would be Abigail's defender, that you would be her great defender, that you would assign mighty warring angels to protect everything you've entrusted to their care. I pray that this book would reach many hearts, that it would save lives. And Abigail, I have a picture of lives being saved, of literally women being rescued, one after another, because of your diligence and your patient endurance. And so I bless you and bless you in the days to come. Amen.
Thank you. Thank you so
You're
much.
welcome.
Friends, as you can tell, Abigail is just infused with wisdom, with character, with courage to fight for things that are true, things that are good, and things that are beautiful. I deeply encourage you to go to Amazon and grab a copy of Irreversible Damage, Abigail's new book, to read her articles in Wall Street Journal, watch her videos on PragerU, and for all our friends out there that want to continue this path and process, this slow and steady work of becoming wholehearted and exploring what it looks like to walk in deeper intimacy with God and to become everything we were made to be when God meant us. Come back and find more at becomegoodsoil.com.